All right, so today we're diving deep into, well, this should be interesting, the world of Supreme Court Justice Alito.
Mm,
And specifically, we're going to be looking at his connection to Trump's efforts to, challenge the 2020 election results.
right.
We've got a recent article from The Intercept and then also a court filing from special counsel Jack Smith.
Okay.
And, like always, we're just trying to lay out the facts here, understand what the implications of all this is.
Yeah, I think this is one of those stories that's really going to surprise some people because it's not something, you don't often hear about this side of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it really makes you think about like the court's place in all of this,
Yeah.
in our political landscape and all that. So, like, how do we even begin with this? Where do we even start?
Well, I think the heart of the story revolves around this figure. You might not be familiar with him, Mark Martin. He
Hmm.
was the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
And, he became increasingly involved in these efforts to keep Trump in power after the 2020 election.
Interesting. So, like, how does a former state Supreme Court justices get involved in something like that? What's the path there?
Yeah, so according to The Intercept, he was actively promoting these theories about election fraud.
Hmm.
And he was pushing this idea that state legislatures have the authority to basically choose electors, regardless of the popular vote in their state.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying state legislatures could like really have that much power to just like overturn what the voters want?
Well, that was the argument being made, and it was a theory that has been, repeatedly rejected by courts,
Hmm.
including the Supreme Court itself.
Right.
But, you know, nevertheless, it became like a really key part of the strategy to challenge the 2020 election results.
Wow, that's pretty alarming. So was he like just talking about this stuff or was he actually like involved in trying to, make these theories a reality?
Yeah, it seems like he was very hands-on, according to The Intercept at least. He was reportedly in contact with Trump, his team, advocating for these legal theories,
Mm.
and he even assisted in drafting a Supreme Court lawsuit, Texas v. Pennsylvania,
Wow.
which really centered around these ideas.
So he was like directly involved in litigation that was attempting to overturn the election results. This is like serious stuff.
Yeah, and it gets even, I think, more interesting or maybe more disturbing, depending on how you view it. On January 6th, the day of the insurrection, Martin had a 9-minute phone call with Trump himself.
What?
Yeah.
9 minutes on January 6th? I mean, come on, you got to wonder what they were talking about.
Exactly. We don't know the content of that call, unfortunately, but it just highlights, how deeply involved he was in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it raises significant questions, especially when we consider Martin's subsequent connection to Justice Alito.
Ah, yes, Alito. Okay, so that's kind of like the whole head scratcher here, right? Like, how do these two figures connect?
Well, this is where things, I think, take a really interesting turn. Just a few weeks after the events of January 6th, Martin could taught a seminar on constitutional law with Justice Alito at Regent University Law School in Virginia.
Regent University, that's the one that like Pat Robertson founded, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking like a pretty, well-known conservative institution.
Exactly.
Right.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing.
Oh,
Alito and Martin went on to teach the seminar again in 2022.
okay, so it's not like unheard of for someone like Alito to teach at, a place like Regent, right? But to teach alongside Mark Martin, someone who is, like we just said, so closely tied to attempts to overturn the election, it just seems like a little bit more than a coincidence, doesn't it?
It does raise some eyebrows, for sure. It makes you wonder if Alito was aware of the extent of Martin's involvement in all of this, in the events surrounding the 2020 election.
Right, and then that also makes you wonder, like, okay, even if he did know, what does that say about Alito's judgment? Like, we're not just talking about some, like, academic debate here. We're talking about, like, the foundation of our democracy being challenged, and here's a Supreme Court justice, seemingly aligning himself with someone who is right in the thick of it.
Yeah, and, it's interesting. Neither Martin nor Alito responded to The Intercept's request for comment on this story.
Of course not.
So,
It's typical.
yeah.
It does makes you wonder, like, what are they trying to hide? It's pretty strange.
Yeah, and I mean, so we have this kind of cloud of potential conflict hanging over Alito.
Right.
Right? And then you've got the special counsel's investigation into Trump.
Right.
Like, how does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So, like, where do we even go with that?
Well, this is where I think the story takes another really fascinating turn, because it's actually special counsel Jack Smith's court filing, which argues that Trump should stand trial for this, for attempting to overturn the election.
Oh,
it kind of inadvertently shines a light back on Alito's potential biases.
Wait, really? Hold on. Like, I'm trying to follow here. How does a court filing about Trump become about Alito?
Okay, so basically, Smith's central argument
Hmm.
is that um, Trump's actions, even as president, right,
Hmm.
were all part of a private scheme. It wasn't like, things that are kind of covered by presidential immunity.
So what you're saying is the argument is that basically Trump wasn't acting as the president when he did all this. He was acting as like, you know, a private citizen, like just a guy who wanted to cling to power.
That's exactly right. And, the thing is that the filing gets into a lot of detail here. It outlines Trump's, pressure campaign on Pence
Oh, right.
to interfere with the election certification process.
Mm-hmm.
It describes how Trump used Twitter to spread misinformation, incite his supporters.
Right. And all of that, especially, the pressure on Pence, that all goes directly back to those legal theories that
Right.
we were just talking about, the ones that Martin was like promoting. Right.
Exactly. And it's a striking parallel when you think about it.
It is.
And it's not, Smith's filing doesn't mention Alito
Right.
or Martin directly,
Right.
but it lays out a pretty compelling case, I think, for how Trump's actions were kind of driven by, self-preservation, a disregard for democratic processes, all of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really makes you wonder, right? Like, okay, so let's say that, like, those actions weren't presidential, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying is they were the actions of, like, a candidate, right?
Right.
So should the judicial system view those actions any differently?
That's the question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is the question. So, okay, I see where you're going with this. You're basically saying that because Alito was, associating with someone who was so deeply, like, entangled in all of this with Trump's efforts, it casts a shadow of doubt on like his ability to actually be impartial in cases related to January 6th or even Trump in general.
Exactly. I mean, at a minimum, it creates the appearance of a conflict of interest.
Right, exactly.
Even if there's no sort of, concrete evidence of any kind of wrongdoing.
Right.
It just doesn't look good. And this is, especially concerning given some of Alito's kind of recent rulings.
Are you talking about that, the ruling where he sided with Trump on that case about immunity from the January 6th investigation?
That's the one.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was part of the minority arguing that Trump should have been granted broader immunity.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like, this is the same justice who was teaching constitutional law.
Right.
With someone who actively helped try to overturn the election.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you actually, like, say it all out loud like that. It really does feel like we're kind of like uncovering a pattern here. We've got Martin kind of like working behind the scenes. We've got Alito teaching with him. And now we have Jack Smith's case that's, kind of inadvertently highlighting how all these events might be like interconnected. What are we supposed to make of all of this?
Well, I think it raises a really significant concern.
Yeah.
About just like the level of closeness,
Mm-hmm.
between members of the judiciary and, people who are literally trying to challenge the outcome of a democratic election.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know, unsettling is the word I would use,
Yeah.
to say the least.
Yeah, it's a little it's a little more than unsettling if you ask me, but I guess we'll see what happens. It really makes you think about like, okay, what does this mean going forward? Especially with 2024 coming up, like, if there are more disputes about the election results, which let's be honest, there probably will be. Those are probably going to end up at the Supreme Court.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's not just future elections we have to think about either. I mean, you look at some of Alito's past rulings on stuff related to this, and they kind of take on a new meaning now, right? Like, remember that speech he gave to the Federalist Society?
Oh, yeah, back in like 2020.
Yeah, 2020. And he was talking about how, he was really concerned about this lack of tolerance for, dissenting viewpoints, particularly within law schools.
Yeah, that speech, I don't know, it always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It felt a little too political for a Supreme Court justice,
Totally. And like, you got to remember too, this was right after the election.
Right.
When all those like, unfounded claims about voter fraud were going around.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if like Alito's own perspective on all of that might have influenced, I don't know, his decision to teach with Mark Martin.
Yeah.
Or even like some of his rulings on cases related to January 6th.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's really hard not to connect those dots, like it feels like there's a pattern here, right? And it all comes back to this like fundamental question of impartiality, like if you were, let's say, a lawyer and you're arguing an election related case and you're going before the Supreme Court today, right now, knowing everything that we know, Would you, like, honestly feel confident in Justice Alito's ability to be fair?
I mean, that's the question every American should be asking themselves right now. Because, at the end of the day, our entire democracy hinges on whether or not people actually trust the courts to be impartial.
Yeah.
And when that trust is gone, I mean, the consequences they're pretty serious.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Well, I think it's safe to say this deep dive has, uncovered a lot, not just like connections, but also some really, really serious questions, especially when it comes to like, potential conflicts of interest. And we're talking like the highest level of our judicial system here.
And the thing is, we might just be scratching the surface, right? Like, if anything, I think this whole thing just highlights how important transparency is
Yeah.
and accountability. Like, we need that from our institutions,
Mm.
especially the Supreme Court.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point to end on. Definitely gives us all a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody.